Three men in dark suits sat in the front row of Studio One at NBC Burbank on the night of April 12th, 1984. Two wore sunglasses indoors. One kept his hands folded in his lap, unmoving. They didn't laugh at Johnny Carson's monologue. They didn't applaud. They just watched. And when Dean Martin walked through the curtain at 11:47 p.m. Pacific Time, his smile, that famous, effortless Dean Martin smile, disappeared for exactly 4 seconds before he forced it back. You're about to hear the story of a Tonight Show moment almost no one remembers. A night when organized crime walked through the front door of America's most beloved late-night show, sat down in plain sight, and waited. What happened next would test the limits of live television, expose the razor-thin line between entertainment and danger, and reveal just how much pressure two legends could handle before something broke. The question staff members would ask each other for years afterward was simple. Did Dean Martin walk into a trap that night, or did he walk in knowing exactly what was waiting for him? The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson operated like clockwork. Guests were booked weeks in advance. Audience members went through careful screening. Security checked credentials. Everything was controlled, predictable, safe. That's how Johnny wanted it. That's how NBC demanded it. But someone had made arrangements. According to crew members who worked that night, the front row seats, positions 7, 8, and 9, had been reserved through NBC's VIP guest system 3 days before the taping. The request came through legitimate channels. A phone call to the right office, the right names mentioned, the right connections implied. Nobody questioned it until the men actually arrived. Stage manager Peter Lassalle later recalled seeing them during the pre-show briefing. Something felt wrong immediately. These weren't tourists. They weren't fans. They carried themselves with a specific kind of stillness that people in the entertainment industry recognized but rarely spoke about openly. The kind of stillness that came from nightclubs in the 50s, from Vegas in the 60s, from the world Dean Martin had spent decades trying to leave behind. But here's what made that night different. Dean Martin was scheduled to appear, and somebody had known that weeks in advance. The audience warm-up comedian did his usual routine at 11:15. The three men didn't smile. Johnny Carson walked out at 11:30 for his monologue. The three men didn't applaud. And when Ed McMahon announced Dean Martin's name at 11:47, the man in the middle, the one with his hands folded, leaned forward slightly in his seat. Just enough for Dean to see him clearly when he stepped through the curtain. Dean Martin had walked through that curtain hundreds of times. The routine was muscle memory. Wave to the audience, shake Johnny's hand, take the chair, smile, charm, make it look effortless. That's what Dean Martin did. That's who America expected him to be. But staff members positioned in the wings later described what they saw differently. Dean stepped through the curtain. His eyes went immediately to the front row. Not scanning, targeting. He saw position 8 first, then his gaze shifted left to position 7, then right to position 9. The entire scan took perhaps 2 seconds. His smile held, but his shoulders changed, a subtle tightening that the camera wouldn't catch, but that anyone standing close enough could recognize. Johnny Carson noticed immediately. His greeting was louder than usual, pulling focus, giving Dean a moment to recover. The audience applauded. The band played Dean's signature theme. Everything looked normal. But Johnny's eyes never left Dean's face during those first 10 seconds. Dean sat down, crossed his legs, leaned back in the chair with that familiar casual elegance. And then he did something he almost never did on The Tonight Show. He looked directly at the audience before Johnny could ask the first question. "Great crowd tonight," Dean said. His voice had that lazy, amused quality that made everything sound like an inside joke. "Really great. Some familiar faces out there." The audience laughed, assuming it was part of the bit. The man in position 8 didn't move. Johnny pivoted immediately, started talking about Dean's new album, asked about a recent performance in Atlantic City, kept the conversation moving, kept the energy light. But crew members later recalled that Johnny's questions that night were shorter than usual, more controlled. He wasn't improvising, he was managing. And Dean understood exactly what Johnny was doing. 12 minutes into the interview, Dean made a joke about Las Vegas. It should have been harmless. Dean always talked about Vegas. It was part of his brand, part of the mythology. The Rat Pack, the casinos, the glamorous danger of it all, softened by time and nostalgia. America loved hearing Dean talk about Vegas. But this joke was different. "You know," Dean said, "I was playing the Sands back in '63, and there was this guy in the front row. Big guy, sunglasses, never smiled, just watched." Dean paused, letting the setup breathe. Turned out he owned the place. The audience laughed. The three men in the front row didn't. Dean's eyes flicked down to position 8 for a fraction of a second, then back to Johnny. "Some people," Dean continued, "you just know. You know what I mean, Johnny?" Johnny laughed, but it was a different laugh, a laugh that filled space. "I don't think I know those kind of people, Dean." "Sure you do," Dean said. His voice was still light, still playful. But something had shifted. "Everybody knows those kind of people. They're everywhere. Sometimes they're right in front of you." The audience laughed again, not understanding. Associate producer Fred D. Cordova, watching from the control booth, later told staff members he'd reached for the commercial button. Not to press it, just to be ready. Just in case. But Johnny Carson did what Johnny Carson always did. He redirected. Asked about Dean's golf game. Got a story going. Pulled the moment back from whatever edge it had been approaching. The question no one could answer afterward was whether Dean had been testing something, or warning someone, or simply unable to resist acknowledging what everyone in that studio could feel but couldn't name. During the first commercial break, Dean Martin didn't stay in his chair. He stood up, walked to the edge of the stage, and looked directly at the three men in the front row. Stagehands later recalled that he said something, not loudly, just a few words. The men didn't respond visibly, but the one in position 8 nodded once, a small, barely perceptible acknowledgement. Then Dean walked back to his chair, sat down, and waited for the cameras to roll again. Johnny Carson had watched the entire exchange from his desk. He didn't move. He didn't intervene. But crew members later described his expression during those 90 seconds as calculating. Johnny was doing math in his head, weighing options, deciding how far this could go before it became something NBC couldn't control. When they came back from commercial, Johnny's first question was about Dean's children. Safe territory. Personal, but not dangerous. The kind of question that would humanize the moment, pull everything back to warmth and nostalgia. Dean answered, but his timing was off. His pauses were longer. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. And then, 23 minutes into the interview, Dean did something that would become the subject of speculation for years. He told a story about his early days performing in mob-controlled nightclubs in Cleveland. "I was 19 years old," Dean began. "Working a club on Mayfield Road. Rough place. You didn't ask questions about who owned it. You just showed up, did your set, took your money, and left." Johnny nodded, encouraging. "But there was this one night," Dean continued, "where a guy in the front row didn't like my material. Big guy, connected guy, you could tell. And he made it known, loudly. The audience was silent now, listening. So I stopped the show," Dean said, "walked to the edge of the stage, and I asked him, 'You want to come up here and do it better?'" Someone in the audience laughed nervously. "He didn't," Dean said, "but his boss, the guy who actually owned the club, he came to my dressing room after the show. And you know what he told me?" Johnny leaned forward slightly. "What?" He said, "Kid, you got guts, but guts only work if the right people are protecting you. Otherwise, you're just stupid." Dean let that sit for a moment. "I never forgot that," he said quietly. The audience didn't know how to respond. Was this a funny story? A cautionary tale? A confession? Johnny Carson smiled his professional smile and said, "Well, you've done pretty well for yourself, Dean." "Have I?" Dean replied. The question hung in the air for 3 full seconds before Johnny transitioned to the next segment. But the damage, or the message, depending on who was interpreting, had been delivered. Fred de Cordova would later describe the atmosphere in the control booth during those final minutes as controlled chaos. Nobody was sure what they were watching. Was Dean drunk? Was he having some kind of breakdown? Or was something else happening? Something scripted in a language the producers didn't speak but recognized anyway. One production assistant later recalled overhearing de Cordova on the phone during the commercial break, speaking quietly to someone at NBC's legal department. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When de Cordova hung up, he reportedly said, "We're finishing the segment, then we're moving on." No explanation, no context, just a decision to let it play out and hope nothing exploded on live television. Meanwhile, on stage, Dean Martin and Johnny Carson were performing a kind of high-wire act that had nothing to do with comedy. They were managing tension, controlling a room, making sure that whatever was happening stayed contained within the boundaries of entertainment. Johnny asked about Dean's upcoming tour. Dean answered. The conversation returned to safe ground. But everyone in that studio, from the cameramen to the audience members to the three men in the front row, understood that something had shifted. A line had been acknowledged, a history had been referenced, and whatever power dynamics existed in that room, they had been made visible, if only for a moment. The segment ended at 12:04 a.m. Dean stood up, shook Johnny's hand, waved to the audience, and walked off stage. The three men in the front row stood up 30 seconds later and left through the main exit. According to security logs, they were gone before Dean reached his dressing room. Dean Martin sat alone in his dressing room for 20 minutes after the taping ended. Multiple crew members passed by. Nobody knocked. Johnny Carson reportedly went to his own dressing room, poured himself a drink, and told his producer, "Don't book him again for a while." Whether him referred to Dean Martin or someone else was never clarified. At 12:37 a.m., Dean left the building through the back exit. His driver was waiting. He got in the car without speaking to anyone. The next morning, Fred de Cordova reviewed the tape of the full episode. According to staff members present, he watched Dean's segment 3 times, made notes, then filed the tape with a single notation in the logbook: air as scheduled, no edits. The episode broadcast 4 days later. Ratings were strong, reviews were positive. Nobody watching at home noticed anything unusual. But within the tight circle of people who worked on The Tonight Show, the night of April 12, 1984, became a reference point, a story told quietly, a reminder that live television was only as controlled as the people in front of the cameras allowed it to be. And sometimes, those people carried histories that the cameras couldn't edit out. In the weeks following the taping, several NBC executives reportedly asked Fred de Cordova about the men in the front row. Who had arranged their seats? How had they gotten through the VIP system? Were there security concerns? De Cordova's answer, according to those conversations, was consistent. It was handled. What handled meant was never explained. Dean Martin returned to The Tonight Show 8 months later. His appearance was warm, funny, and completely controlled. No stories about Cleveland nightclubs, no references to Vegas, no acknowledgments of anyone in the audience. Johnny Carson never mentioned the April episode, not in interviews, not in his memoir, not in private conversations with staff members who later wrote their own accounts of working on the show. It was as if the night had been collectively agreed upon as something that happened, was managed, and then quietly archived. But here's what makes that night impossible to forget. Dean Martin was an entertainer who built his career on making everything look effortless, on hiding the work, on never letting the audience see the machinery. Yet on April 12, 1984, for exactly 23 minutes, he let something show. Whether it was fear, defiance, acknowledgement, or warning, nobody could quite agree. What everyone did agree on was this. Dean Martin walked into Studio One that night knowing exactly who was waiting for him in the front row, and he performed anyway. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson aired for 30 years, 6,000 episodes, thousands of guests, countless moments of television history. But the night when organized crime sat in the front row and Dean Martin stared back has remained one of the most quietly discussed episodes among people who worked on the show. Not because of what happened. Nothing overtly dramatic occurred. No fights, no explicit threats, no scandals that made the newspapers. But because of what it revealed, the enormous pressure of live television, when the people in the room carry histories that can't be controlled by producers or managed by network executives. Dean Martin understood that pressure better than almost anyone in show business. He'd been performing for dangerous audiences since he was 19 years old. He knew how to read a room, how to gauge power, how to deliver a message without saying anything that could be quoted in a deposition. And Johnny Carson, in his own way, understood the same calculations. He'd spent decades controlling chaos, managing egos, navigating the impossible balance between entertainment and exposure. That night, both of them performed their roles perfectly. Dean Martin was charming, funny, and just dangerous enough to keep things interesting. Johnny Carson was professional, supportive, and just detached enough to maintain control. The three men in the front row got whatever message they came for, and millions of Americans watching at home saw a perfectly entertaining late-night talk show segment, completely unaware of the tension simmering underneath every laugh. In 1995, 11 years after that April taping, a journalist interviewing former Tonight Show staff members for a book about Johnny Carson asked about memorable audience interactions. One crew member mentioned the night with the three men in the front row. The journalist asked for details, names, context. The crew member reportedly smiled and said, "Some stories are better left in the archive." The journalist pressed, "Was Dean Martin in danger that night?" "Dean Martin," the crew member replied, "was always in some kind of danger. That's what made him Dean Martin." The exchange never made it into the book. But the question remains, decades later, quietly persistent among the people who remember. What were those three men in the front row really there to see? A performance? A tribute? A test? And what did Dean Martin understand about that night that the rest of us, watching from our living rooms, could never fully grasp? The tape still exists in NBC's archive. The footage is clear, the audio is clean, every word Dean Martin said that night is preserved. But the real conversation, the one happening beneath the jokes and the stories and the carefully managed smiles, was never recorded at all. It happened in the silences between words, in the glances, in the weight of histories that cameras can capture but never truly explain. Dean Martin walked off that stage at 12:04 a.m. on April 12, 1984, and whatever message he delivered or received went with him.